So, hey, everybody, it's Joy Forrest with Call to Peace Ministries. And today I'm here with my new friend, Sharon Nolan. And Sharon reached out to us through Call to Peace Ministries and has a pretty interesting background working with domestic violence services. Tell us a little bit about that.
Certainly, yes, I'm continuing to learn. But yes. So I was up as a domestic violence advocate, a survivor advocate up in New York for probably approximately 4 years. And had done various roles with them within that, everything from the fundraising to the education and some domestic violence survivor advocacy services. So I had worked with them for a little bit, and then outside of that, then have now moved to Virginia here with my children. And I had found you through, I just really wanted to get active again, and coming alongside women, just really feeling a calling. So as I was searching, but I felt the faith-based was so important. I think that's so important in the healing that many times you're not going to find that in the secular services. So I was looking for something that was similar to that, and that's how I found you.
And were you the one that said, you've already started what I was going to start?
Absolutely. Yes. Everything that I felt like I had this vision for, was like, that everything from the education to the advocacy to the outreach, to reaching out to churches, our counselors with the education as well as the women, and then the primary, like you said, the support groups, and then the one-on-one counseling for the women. But there was no way I knew I was going to be able to accomplish that myself. So as I was trying to search for something that offered, and truly I do believe they're pretty much about the only one I could find that really offers, that entire vision that I had seen that is faith-based.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I mean, I still believe this is God's heart. And so it's interesting because he continues to send new people who have that vision. And I think there are a lot of us out here who have it. And so anyway, I think we've got to band together. So you have joined our support group leaders forum. And in one of the forums, the online forums, we had a woman ask about anger, about her children being so angry after she left the abuser. I mean, just having all sorts of issues with her son. I had the same thing happen in my family. My daughter got extremely angry once her dad was out of the picture. I mean, we separated, and then it was like I was dealing with my children who were acting the exact same way as their dad. And anyway, so we know that that's pretty common, that usually after a separation, what will happen is that the children will get angry at one of the parents, and it's usually not the abuser, it's usually the safe parent. And so I love that you had specific training on that. Tell me a little bit about what you learned through your advocacy program in New York about dealing with your children.
A couple of things is that we did learn that through the domestic violence advocacy. Now, we would always point the woman and the children to the counselors or to the social workers that had been trained, in the trauma of the children, of course, but they gave us a lot of training in the matters of that. Is that once the children, the women are kind of on the other side of the domestic violence, is that many times the women are so broken, at that point, that they've got a lot of healing from the trauma that they need to do themselves. And they're also very weary. And many times they also begin parenting out of guilt. The children have already been faced with so much trauma and sometimes abuse for themselves. And so sometimes the women, number one, they need healing for themselves, as well as they need to have be given some proper parenting skills, because so many times they just are so lost and they feel guilty trying to parent or set any kind of boundaries because of the pain and the trauma the children have been through. So at the domestic violence shelter, what they had given us, and even through my own experience too, this was amazingly helpful. This was a journey I had to go through myself. As you had mentioned, each one of my children had reacted in different ways, as most children will. Some will be with anger and with rage and violence, other children withdrawing, other children self-harming, whatever it may be. They'll react in many different ways. But, especially for the ones that are acting out. So normally what we do is there would be 4 parts. And the first part would be to making sure that that the woman is being able to control their own emotions, to be able to create their own healing within themselves. They're going to have to heal from the trauma and from the PTSD. And that as they are responding, as I know personally too, so many times is we become very reactive because of our own pain, number one, and number two, sometimes looking at our child and that fear of them being the future abuser or something, and so overreacting to that. So number one is learning, to control
I'm
and
going
to
to give
temper
a
emotions.
comment on that one.
Sure.
I remember I hadn't been separated from my ex-husband long, and we were driving down the road, and the kids were screaming and fighting in the background, and I slammed on brakes, and I mean screeched. My car is
Yep.
going like this, and I get over to, and I'm screaming, "Stop it! Just stop it! Stop it!" And wow, Proverbs tells us don't associate with an angry man lest you learn his ways and find yourself
Yes.
ensnared, right? And that's exactly what happened. And so then I just pull back on the road and I start driving, and it's like the Holy Spirit's like, really, are you just going to keep going? Or are you going to stop and say to let them know that was wrong? So I pull back over again, and I said, I am so sorry for what just happened. We've all learned to be angry and to yell, but that's not right. That's not God's way. So I did apologize to my children and tried to tell them that I was going to try to do better. And it does take a while, because as you mentioned, most survivors that we work with, about 80% at least, I mean, that's just the statistic that goes with it. About 80% of the women who come, or anybody who comes through domestic abuse, will suffer from complex PTSD.
Yep.
And so that does make it way harder to regulate your emotions, but we have to, it's not impossible. So
No.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I just wanted to throw that in there.
No, absolutely. That's very good. No, that's excellent. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And like you said, being able to turn to God and turn to his word also, for that healing there truly is. And then being able to do that parallel. Absolutely. And I found that myself too, that as I was beginning to heal and I was beginning to learn some coping strategies, being able to hand it over to him, I was able to regulate my emotions so much better. And again, we need to make sure we're also, that we are showing proper coping skills to our children as we're going through this transition and through this healing too. So, and then the second one is that being able to provide your children with some healthy coping strategies, or ways to be able to manage their own frustration or their anger, or, that, when they're not sure, what to do with all of these emotions of fear and uncertainty and things like that, that may end up manifesting itself in anger and in unhealthy ways. And so, and the thing is that the response has to be immediate, is that beginning to teach these children immediately from the moment, if you've left the home or whatever it may be, is that first day when you're at the shelter or the aunt's house or whatever it may be, is being able to immediately begin putting some of these strategies in place, because the longer you let it wait, then the deeper that the seeds get implanted, and the more difficult it is to undo the damage at that point. So that's the reason that I know that was some of the training, is it would have to be done almost like the very first day, is beginning then. It's going to take time. It's going to take patience, but is providing them at that point. And so giving them, and again, working with, counselors that are trained in this, as well as any kind of social workers, is that being able to create some healthy coping strategies. These are the things that the children will be able to do when they're feeling that frustration or that anger or that pain beginning to arise in them. So being able to give them that tool, or what we would call it as a toolbox. And they would create their own toolbox. Okay, these are all the things I'm going to do. And again, it's going to take time and patience and everything, but being able to give them some of those tools. What do I do when this is rising up? What's an alternative to?
And I think we have to model it as well. I know that I was so emotional when we're coming out, and we have so much trauma. It's hard for us not to react. And so we have to learn ourselves not to react. That was one of the first thing you said, is that they have to, the parent, the mom herself has got to get her own emotions under control to some degree, to be able to, at least a functional degree for the household. I've told women in the past, even when they were reacting to things that were going on in their home, trying to teach them not to react, even if you are screaming on the inside, you can't show that. So I would tell them, call me afterwards. You can call and scream at me, or you can tell me what's going on. You can express your frustration, but if you do it now even with your husband before she got out, what was happening is that the husband was provoking on purpose, then turning around and recording her to show the pastors what an unstable woman she was. So as I taught her not to react, he got more unstable and more reactive and explosive himself. And it showed who the true, where the problem, the source of the problem. But so I think that it's the same with our kids, that we have to learn not to react to them. And even if we're feeling it, I think that journaling is a powerful thing, a way to learn how to express what's going on inside you. Pouring out I think a journal to God. I said mine was a prayer journal. I wrote my own Psalms, and I think that's what the Psalms are. It's pouring out emotion to God. So there are healthy ways of dealing with it and unhealthy ways. And we have to learn the healthy ways. We have to model it for our kids, or they're going to do what they see.
Absolutely.
They're already seeing terrible, probably at the abuser's house, if they're going to different places. So we have to be the model.
Amen. Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. No, I absolutely agree with that. Yes. Like you said, is absolutely modeling that, and then finding, like you said, is our own, kind of strategies for that. And you had mentioned that before too, rehearsing it ahead of time.
Yes.
Making sure before, as if you are going to be encountering some type of problem or something, rehearsing in your mind over and over and over again, how am I going to handle that? So I'm not handling that with reaction, as you're continuing to heal. Absolutely. And
because we will go back to our default unless we start practicing in our minds, and even written on paper, or, practicing a conversation even out loud. Because we go back to what we're used to. Even if I didn't grow up with screaming and yelling in my house, and I never yelled, but you do learn it once you've been in it. Because there were times where he would just be relentless. And if I didn't, screaming would finally get him to back down. And I had not been a screamer, so I learned to be one. And so you're going to go back to your default unless you have another plan. So you have to have a concrete plan on how you're going to react. If this happens, I will do this. I will say this, and even, well, we'll get to this, but talking to your child when they're not all upset, so that you can say, this is what's going to happen. Give them, we have a framework to work within. So I probably just stole some of your stuff.
Oh, actually, no, that's perfect. That forays right back into then the next one. Absolutely. Is that speaking to them ahead of time, and even almost like the moment that you're stepping into leaving, or saying explaining to them, this is going to be a really painful time. And I know you're going to be feeling, very emotional, whatever it may be. We are going to sit down though and make a list of the behavior that's going to be expected. And so that we're able to speak to each other, as you were mentioning before, is setting the boundaries of, this is where, my boundaries are going to be for mom, as well as the expectations for other people, siblings, whatever it may be. For the boundaries of how I expect to be treated, and being able to express that to the child, is saying, this is where the boundaries are going to be. And really, one of the things they would do, and again, different counselors may have different strategies, but I know this is how they would do it in the shelters, that they would actually have everything written down for the child. So everything was clear, and they would sit down and talk about, these are exactly what the expectations are. When you're either in disagreement, if you're feeling angry, the way that you're going to, to express yourself, whatever it may be, they would have like a whole list of what would they consider those boundaries to be. And then, within the home and among siblings, whatever it may be. And again, going back to that first one, is that this is the boundaries, but these are ways that you can think about it, or this is the way, you can have your different coping strategies. And one of the examples is, I know they had said that I think it's every person faces at least 24 frustrations a day. And you need to learn to react to those.
I'm above average. I'm just above average.
Exactly. I know, yeah. But that's what I remember my son saying that to me one time. He's like, you don't understand. I have, 1,000 frustrations a day. I was like, okay, you have 1,000 frustrations a day. So 1,000 times you're going to need to.
Yeah.
to be able to know then what those, what you're going to do in those instances. And it may just be, again, you give the children other toolbox, you say, this is the boundaries, and this is kind of what you'll do, whether it is, for instance, say things like, it's not that big of a deal, I'm going to let it go. Is the self-talk is like one of the tools in the toolbox.
Mm-hmm.
Another tool might be going for a walk. Another tool might be listening to music, whatever it may be. And so you can say, this is the boundaries. And if you're feeling this rising up, this is what is going to be your tool. The children help create that, the tools in the toolbox. And then after that, if the boundaries are crossed, you need to have consequences that are set. And so for that, but they have to be reasonable, but also realistic. But they also have to be strong enough that the child can weigh the cost benefit analysis on that. And so they can say, whoa, yeah, if I cross this, it's not worth the cost. And so one of the very hardest parts for the women is the consistency. You've got to be consistent every time. And it's very hard sometimes, because if they have crossed that boundary and all of a sudden for the next 3 days, they are the biggest, the most amazing sweethearts you could imagine. And then you can say, oh, okay, never mind. It's okay. I'll, give you back the privilege of not being grounded this weekend, whatever it may be. And so that is the hardest, I know, for the women. And I know that was one of the hardest things for me too. But if you don't instill that consistency, or if you're saying, okay, I'm just going to give you 2 warnings, and then the third time, that doesn't work either. Because if you do that, then you're basically showing them they'll be able to get away with their reactiveness. And also, number 2, it's okay if I do it 2 times as long as I'm good the third time. And so that is always the hardest part. And it's going to take a lot of patience, because those boundaries are going to be crossed a lot. And it's very painful to have to then implement the consequences, like you said, like we talked about, on a child that has already been through a fairly traumatic,
right.
Whatever it may be, is the trauma they may have incurred during, in the house before. But it's so important, because it's out of your love for them. It truly is out of your love for them, because you want them to get to the other side. And I wish I had the statistics, but I remember seeing is that what are the chances for a child that is coming out of an abusive home? And when a mom is able to implement some of these strategies and the parenting skills, it goes from, it's like, and I want to say it's probably like 80% where a child is going to repeat it, down to like 20%. And so if you're really teaching them, and they learn, okay, this is how I'm going to learn how to cope. These are reasonable expectations for how I'm going to treat another person or respect them, when they haven't been taught that before. That has not been modeled for them.
Yeah, I want to say, as you're talking, I think about, to me, there's an uncanny number of abusers who have doting mothers who never set boundaries with them, and they
Yes.
don't understand consequences. So we actually could be breeding an abuser when we fail to provide our kids with consequences and boundaries. I remember I told people I didn't even know what a boundary was until I was almost 40 years old, and coming out of that relationship, I never said no to my husband's, mistreatment. I basically allowed him to mistreat me, in the name of submission quite a bit. I tell people I had a doormat theology. And, and so I had kind of the same thing with my children. I didn't know how to even, I knew harsh. It wasn't even discipline. It was punishment. I knew how to punish them if they'd done something really bad, or if I was afraid they were going to, cause more trouble with their dad, then I was very harsh and I would punish, but I didn't know how to lead and how to set boundaries. And I mean, it was a whole new learning curve for me when I came out of the abuse. And I knew you had mentioned it before. A lot of times as parents, because of the abuse that our kids have gone through, and that's, that was the case with my ex. I think his mom felt so bad for him because of the abuse that was going on in the house that he got away with a lot. But when we allow them to get away with so much, it doesn't do them any good. It doesn't serve them well in life. And a lot of times they end up coming up with this sense of entitlement that the world owes them. They end up with a victim mentality, and the victim mentality is what's usually behind the abuser.
Yes.
So, the guilt, not allowing guilt to speak into our parenting. I think we've talked about this in our support group leaders forum. I don't think that any kind of emotion should ever be what leads us. It should be God's Holy Spirit, right? And wisdom. And so when we allow any kind of emotion to rule us, it usually doesn't turn out very well. So.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I absolutely agree too. That was exactly what I had learned. And when I went in for the training for the advocacy, that was exactly it too. They had said many times the moms, took a very backseat role and just allowed them and didn't set any boundaries, also as they were going through their teenage years. So that's, so certainly I had learned exactly the same thing in regard to that too. And so when you are, like, let's say the boundary has been crossed, is all you do, you go back to that contract that you had written and said, okay, the boundary was crossed, as these are going to be your consequences for the weekend. You are going to get reactions, and you are going to have that child say they hate you, and you're going to have that child, react because, now this is painful for them because they have now lost their privilege for the weekend, whatever it may be. And so the same thing, you act with no emotion whatsoever. You don't even need to explain. You just say, we crossed the boundary. These are the consequences. We talked about it, and you can walk away. And just do it completely. I loved how you had said that. Was it the gray rock? Or was it the
gray rock method? Yeah.
Gray rock method. Yeah.
Go gray rock with our children. So that means
yes.
No emotion. We are the gray rock. And, I think that what we're talking about is very scriptural. I think that's the way God deals with us as his children, not that he's emotionless, but he says, these are the boundaries. And if you cross, there's going to be consequences. And even in the book of Jeremiah, it says your own sins will punish you. And so basically we allow them natural consequences. We allow them to suffer the natural consequences that would happen as a result of their disobedience or whatever it may be. And I think that is the most powerful teacher. My punishment didn't work very well, but natural consequences, again, God, I think, allows that for us. I mean, he lets us see, and we should be learning from our mistakes. But if there are no consequences, obviously we won't learn as much. So I think that it's so important that we do set these for the kids.
Absolutely. And through the persistence and perseverance in that, it's going to take some time, but I guarantee, you will see the results. Is that whatever parent is going through this, you will see the results. And even, for my own son, just one example is we used to go to this pond where they would take canoes out on the pond and things. And we would get to the pond and he would start to react over something, like one of his sisters had said or done. I would immediately put him back in the car and drive him home. And then I had to do that about 4 or 5 times until then then I would see him starting to use his tools. All of a sudden, then we would get to the pond that 5th time and I could see him get mad at something one of the girls said or did. And then he said, he would take some deep breaths and he would go for a little bit of a walk. And then he'd say, what you said kind of hurt my feelings and I'm mad at you. And so, but he would say in a very calm demeanor, but it was, and I was like, yes, after, you will see persistence paying off, and it's very hard. It's very hard as a mom, to do that. But, in the long run, you'll be amazed at,
that's awesome.
At the changes.
Yeah. Like there was a time that I had to set aside with my kids and I am going to this weekend, any time I get, pushback or if they're talking back in an ugly way or whatever it is, there's going to be an immediate consequence. It takes effort. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of planning, preparation even, but to be able to know ahead of time what you're going to do, like, okay, you can't do this. If you do, then we're going to stop whatever pleasant activity that we had planned. I think that's another natural consequence. And, my own daughter ended up going to a wilderness camp, and that's what happened. What would happen is if one of the campers did something they weren't supposed to do, the whole group suffered. See, and your daughter suffered when your son was doing what he ought to not have done. And I think one thing that you talked about, I'm not sure that we've talked about here, is active listening and what that means.
Absolutely, yes. And so for that one, that is basically being able to have some separate time, is definitely intentionally plan some time individually, one-on-one with each of your children. I know sometimes that is very, very hard, when you're coming out of a situation, trying to work, dealing with all of the other things that are going on, but it's very, very important and very crucial. And so if you can set a time aside, make sure it's not during a time, when there has been an outburst, because you want to make sure there's not a connection as a reward, basically. And so you want to make sure it's completely separate. So just say, listen, on Monday, why don't we go out and, have ice cream or go for a walk, hike, whatever it may be. Or just sit down. Me and my son would go out on the porch swing. And so that became one of his favorite things, and just hang out there for a little bit. And it would just be, tell me your highs and lows of the day. How are you doing? And so is there anything you want to talk about? Just let them talk. And so without any judgment or anything, just so they know that you're there. Again, it may take a little bit of time, but just they start to get used to, it becomes like a safe place for them. It's a safe place that, again, with no judgment or anything, that they're able to really talk and express their emotions, and feel like it's a time they can have a little bit of output for whatever may be bottled up inside of them during that time. You also begin to create a much healthier parent bond too, the mother-child bond with them during that time, which is also going to be very, very crucial during that time. It's also time when you're able to, again, express, just think, wow, I think you just did so amazing this week. I cannot begin to tell you how proud I am, when I saw the ways that, that you were reacting, whatever it may be, but during that time is just to be some positive time.
So would you use that time as well to discuss, because things have finally calmed down, and let's discuss, and you talk about your motives as a parent, like, I love you, and this is the reason that, we really, I so want us to be able to stick with this plan that we've made because I love you. And I don't know. I just remember years ago reading Shepherding a Child's Heart, and he talked about the same kind of thing, where you have these quiet times where you can reach the child's a whole lot better because they're not upset. You don't want to have these deep conversations when they're upset. And so, choosing a time when they're calm, and then, you could talk through everything, and then maybe either at the end, but I don't know, I'm actually asking you, would that be something that you would bring up during those times, or would you save it for another time?
Yeah. Many times I would separate it. Again, is that in working with a counselor, and everybody knows their own children, specifically what may work best. Many times I would try to, separate the discussions, because many times your little contract thing, you end up renewing it or redoing it or tweaking it and things like that. And so, so many times during that time, it would just be their time to be able to talk. Then I would separate other times to talk about, about expectations as well as, but during that time, you can also talk about, because it's things that it's okay to not be quiet, about it. It's okay to not brush things under the rug, but just to say, I understand, your emotions may feel conflicted. I'm sure you have so much love still for your father, but at the same time, might be angry or questioning why we had to leave, whatever it may be. It's okay to feel mixed emotions. It's okay to let them, it's basically put on the table. So that way, if they want to talk about it, they can. So it's okay to then help them to understand you do understand their emotions and what they're feeling. But a lot of times I would separate as far as the expectations and the boundaries and everything, something separate, so that time would only just be their time to be able to talk. But a lot of times the time of what I would consider that alone time with them was a little bit separate from, so I guess maybe two separate times. One would be to kind of revisit what had happened during a calm time, but then also just a time of, just you and them, just to be able to, and it doesn't have to be, 2 hours or anything, it could just be, sometimes it would be 15 minutes. And
yeah. Well, so, and you did this, and your kids are grown now, right? Pretty much.
Yes, pretty much. Yeah.
So, and it worked.
Yes. I mean, absolutely. Like all of us, we're still going to have some scars, from our childhood. I don't think that anyone is going to be to grow up unscathed, whether it's in an abusive or non-abusive environment that they had grown up in. So I think all of us are going to have some scars and after effects. But I have to believe that overall, even today, my son being 20 years old, and even my daughters too, is watching them move towards their coping strategies. And so that were instilled, 8-10 years ago. And so it's really interesting to see watching them, using all those tools that were in their toolbox from before. And so, certainly there's still, some residual effects, but certainly I don't think to the effect that it would have been, if I wouldn't have walked through two things, my own healing, and so in creating my own responsiveness, and calming myself and my own emotions. And then second, making sure that I set some strategies in place for my own children for their own healing too.
Yeah. And I think that it is so important. I think, again, we're coming out of a place of not understanding how to do that. So it takes us time to learn it. I mean, I know that now I've probably been out 2 years when I finally started figuring out, I've got to get some boundaries in place. And it was difficult. I had some really rough years with my girls, but, God was gracious and merciful. And I did learn to allow them to suffer their natural consequences, and things turned around. I'm not sure I always did it properly. I'm sure or correctly. I know I didn't, but I know God is gracious. But we do know too that children who grow up with domestic abuse are more likely. They have so many more likelies. They're more likely to be sexually promiscuous, more likely to use drugs, more likely to drop out of school, more likely to end up in prison or involved with the penal system. And the list goes on, including health risk and everything else. So if we can implement these things that you're talking about, we certainly are going to give them a much better chance at life. I think, again, that all of these things that we're talking about, they line up with scriptural truth, where we are instilling our kids with truth and limits. God gives us limits to live within. There's nothing wrong with that. And we're saying there are consequences for what you do that is wrong. That is, again, very biblical in my mind. So I think that, and the reason he does that is because he loves us. It's not because he wants to be some, take away all the good stuff. He's doing it because he loves us. So to me, what you're talking about here is just loving your children well.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, definitely.
So any last comments, suggestions, any last words you want to leave the folks with?
I think that's about all. And again, just going back to what we had talked about earlier today in the group is just trusting God. When I was also able to do that, to take my children and just lay him at my feet during those tough times, the dark times. And the same thing, it was quite a few years, before I felt like we got to some place of solid ground. But in those times, as being able to trust him, as I know you love my children even more than I do, which I can't even imagine. And knowing that that I could just lay them and their future at his feet also.
Amen. Well, that's a good place to end it. Thank you so much, Sharon. This was really helpful. I know we have a lot of ladies in our online support group who deal with this, but I'm sure that many of the ones who are following our page are going to appreciate it too. So thank you so much. And maybe we'll do this again for something else in the future. Who knows?
Okay. Thank you, Joy. Thank you so much.
Thanks.